It was a cold December night, and everything seemed routine. A freight train rolled steadily through New Jersey, carrying millions of dollars worth of valuable cargo. Its journey was uneventful, or so it seemed. But somewhere along the tracks, hidden in the darkness, a group of men were waiting. As the train picked up speed, they moved quickly and quietly, blending into the shadows. Within moments, they were running alongside the massive steel cars, breaking locks and climbing inside. Box after box of expensive goods disappeared into the night, leaving no trace of how it happened. By the time the train reached its destination, the cargo was gone, and the thieves had vanished without a sound. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a years-long crime spree that baffled authorities and left millions of dollars missing. The perpetrators, a group of men known as the Conrail Boyz, one of the most daring, elusive, and organized train robbery crews in the American history. But how did they pull it off for so long? And what finally brought them down? In the 1990s, freight trains were a lifeline for businesses across the eastern United States. Billions of dollars worth of consumer goods traveled these railways annually, with a significant portion passing through New Jersey, bound for distribution hubs in New York and beyond. From high-end electronics to designer clothing, these trains carried some of the most valuable cargo in the retail supply chain. Conrail, one of the largest freight companies in the region, managed thousands of rail cars traveling across hundreds of miles of track. Their network was massive, running through industrial hubs, quiet suburbs, and desolate stretches of land. While this scale was vital to commerce, it also created vulnerabilities. Monitoring every yard, junction, and mile of track was simply impossible. Security measures existed but had their limits. Rail yards relied on fences and guards, but the sheer number of cars and containers made it easy for determined thieves to find gaps in coverage. Moving trains were even harder to protect. With so much track cutting through remote areas, thieves could strike in the dead of night, far from the watchful eyes of law enforcement. For most, these vulnerabilities were just a reality of logistics. But for a group of thieves, later known as the Conrail Boyz, they were an opportunity. This gang didn't stumble into train robbery. They studied it. They learned how the system worked, which rail cars carried the most valuable goods, and when security would be lightest. The goods they stole weren't random. They targeted luxury items, designer clothing, high-end electronics, and other merchandise with high resale value. In one heist, the crew made off with $200,000 worth of Tommy Hilfiger clothing in a single night. Their tactics were so effective that Conrail was forced to assign armed escorts to its trains, yet even these measures weren't enough to stop them. Edward Mongan, the leader of the Conrail Boyz, grew up near the tracks in Hoboken, New Jersey, watching trains come and go. To him, they weren't just a mode of transportation, they were a gold mine. And by the late 1990s, Mongan and his crew were pulling off heists that left law enforcement scrambling. Edward's home overlooked the tracks, and from a young age, Mongan developed a fascination with the freight trains that passed through his neighborhood. In the late 1980s, as a teenager, Mongan began sneaking into nearby rail yards with friends. At first, it was petty vandalism and minor thefts. Mongan began studying the train schedules and patterns, learning when certain rail cars would be parked in the yards and which ones carried valuable cargo. By the time he was 14, Mongan had already been arrested for theft. But the consequences didn't deter him. In fact, the experience seemed to sharpen his focus. Over time, he graduated from stealing small items to targeting entire shipments. Mongan's ability to observe and learn set him apart. He started to understand the vulnerabilities in the rail system, how the security guards operated when the yards were least protected, and which containers were worth targeting. One of Mongan's early breakthroughs came when he managed to steal a two-way radio used by train operators and dispatchers. With this device, Mongan could listen in on communications between train engineers, yardmasters, and even law enforcement. This gave him critical insight into the movement of trains and the presence of security, allowing him to plan his heists with precision. By the early 1990s, Mongan's crew had evolved into a well-organized team. They called themselves the Conrail Boyz. Mongan was known as the Brain, a nickname that reflected his role as the group's strategist. He developed techniques to bypass rail yard security, such as using jumper cables to disable the electrical currents running through fences. Mongan also knew how to manage his crew. His second-in-command, Michael Santano, was a towering figure who often acted as the group's enforcer. Mongan kept Santano close, knowing that his intimidating presence could help maintain order within the gang. Despite dealing with members who had extensive criminal records, Mongan managed to keep the group focused and united under his leadership. What truly set Mongan apart was his ability to adapt and innovate. When increased security in the rail yards made stationary thefts more difficult, Mongan turned his attention to moving trains. This marked a turning point in the Conrail Boyz operations. By the late 1990s, Edward Mongan had transformed the Conrail Boyz into one of the most notorious train robbery crews in modern history. Interestingly, the gang's operations often began days or even weeks before a heist. Mongan relied on the two-way radios he had stolen to listen in on train communications. By monitoring these conversations, Mongan could identify railcars carrying high-value goods, such as electronics or designer clothing. Spotters were another key part of the process. Crew members were stationed at rail yards or along key stretches of track to observe train movements and take notes. They watched for patterns in security patrols, the positioning of railcars, and even the timing of train arrivals and departures. This scouting allowed Mongan to pinpoint weak points in the system and determine the best time and place to strike. Then the team had jumpers who were responsible for boarding the train and accessing the targeted railcars, loaders whose focus was to remove the stolen cargo and transfer it to waiting vehicles, and lastly, drivers who were expected to manage the getaway vehicles, ensuring a quick and efficient escape. This division of labor ensured that every crew member knew their role and could execute it without confusion. It also allowed the gang to operate with military-like precision, reducing the chances of mistakes. Now, back to Mongan. Mongan's understanding of the rail system was second to none. He had studied how trains operated, from their schedules to the markings that identified specific cars. These markings, printed on the sides of rail cars, contained codes that indicated the type of cargo inside. Mongan used this knowledge to focus only on rail cars carrying the most valuable goods, ensuring that every heist yielded a significant payoff. This attention to detail allowed him to avoid surprises and minimize risks. The gang's planning extended to their escape routes. Mongan often selected locations near swamps, industrial areas, or other remote terrain to stage their heists. These areas provided natural cover, making it easier for the crew to evade law enforcement if they were spotted. They also used unmarked vans or vehicles stolen from the rail yards themselves, blending in with the environment to avoid raising suspicion. For Mongan, preparation was everything. Every heist was mapped out like a puzzle, with each piece carefully placed to ensure the operation went smoothly. This level of planning was what made the Conrail Boyz so successful and so difficult for law enforcement to catch. Once the planning was complete, the Conrail Boyz turned their attention to execution. One of the gang's earliest tactics involved targeting stationary railcars in rail yards. Once they had chosen a target, they disabled the electrified fences that surrounded the yards. To do this, they used jumper cables to redirect the electrical current, creating safe entry points without triggering alarms. This innovation gave them unhindered access to the yards, where they could break into rail cars and unload their contents. While effective, these operations required time and posed risks, especially as security in the yards increased. In response to the tightening of security, the Conrail Boyz made a dramatic shift by targeting moving trains. This was no small leap. Stealing from a train in motion required exceptional coordination and physical skill. It also demanded a precise knowledge of train schedules and the ability to identify specific rail cars on the move. The crew would position themselves along remote stretches of track, often in isolated areas where police presence was minimal. These locations, surrounded by swamps or industrial zones, provided cover and reduced the risk of being seen. When a targeted train approached, the jumpers would spring into action. They ran alongside the train, matching its speed, which often ranged between 20 and 30 miles per hour. The timing was everything. Jumping too soon or too late could result in serious injury or derail the operation. Once aboard, the jumpers moved swiftly along the narrow ledges of the train cars, holding onto handrails for balance. Their goal was to locate the pre-identified railcar carrying high-value cargo, which they accessed using specialized tools to pry open the doors. Inside the railcars, the crew worked with remarkable efficiency. They moved quickly to unload boxes of goods, passing them down to loaders waiting below. The loaders then transferred the stolen cargo to a getaway vehicle, often a van stolen from a nearby rail yard. To avoid suspicion, the entire process was a race against time. The crew had only minutes to complete their work before the train reached the next checkpoint or entered a more heavily monitored area. The danger didn't end once the goods were off the train. To ensure a clean getaway, the gang relied on counter-surveillance techniques. Spotters monitored police scanners and watched for approaching vehicles, ready to signal the crew at the first sign of trouble. If law enforcement arrived unexpectedly, the gang had contingency plans in place. Jumpers could leap from the train and disappear into the surrounding swamps or industrial terrain, leaving little evidence behind. What made the Conrail Boyz truly unique was their ability to adapt. As law enforcement improved their tracking efforts, the gang refined their tactics. Mongan, the mastermind, even impersonated dispatchers on the stolen radios, providing his crew with up-to-the-minute updates on train movements. This constant evolution kept them ahead of the authorities and allowed them to carry out heists that seemed almost impossible. One of the most significant changes was the gang's use of technology. Mongan began impersonating rail dispatchers over the radio, feeding misinformation to train engineers, and manipulating schedules to create opportunities for the crew. This tactic allowed the Conrail Boyz to strike at just the right moment, bypassing police patrols and ensuring maximum efficiency during their heists. Mongan also introduced encrypted Nextel phones to the operation. These phones, which scrambled voice transmissions, made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to intercept their communications. This move was a game-changer, giving the gang the confidence to plan more complex and higher-stakes robberies without fear of being overheard. Their network of buyers, or fences, was another critical element of their success. Mongan personally controlled this part of the operation, meeting directly with the fences to sell the stolen goods. This level of secrecy ensured that the rest of the crew remained in the dark about who the buyers were, making it harder for law enforcement to trace the stolen merchandise. By focusing on high-value items like electronics, designer clothing, and luxury goods, the gang ensured that every heist yielded significant profits. The crew quickly mastered every technique, executing their heists with a level of precision that left authorities baffled. Their profits grew, but so did their visibility. By the late 1990s, the Conrail Boyz had become a major target for law enforcement. Rail companies were losing millions of dollars in goods, and public pressure mounted to bring the thieves to justice. Despite this, Mongan continued to refine his operation, staying ahead of the authorities with new tactics and tools. By the late 1990s, the Conrail Boyz had perfected their craft, and December 17, 1999, marked one of their boldest and most infamous heists. The target was a rail car carrying $200,000 worth of Tommy Hilfiger clothing. As usual, the planning for the operation began days in advance. Mongan, as usual, relied on stolen radio communications to gather critical information about the shipment. He identified the rail car carrying the designer clothing and determined its exact position within the train. Spotters were deployed along the train's route to observe its movement and ensure that no law enforcement or unexpected obstacles would interfere with the operation. The heist was planned for a remote stretch of track near North Bergen, New Jersey, an area surrounded by swampy terrain and industrial buildings. Mongan assigned roles with military precision. Jumpers were tasked with boarding the train and accessing the railcar. Loaders would transfer the stolen goods to a getaway vehicle, and drivers were responsible for transporting the cargo safely out of the area. As the train approached the intercept point, the crew got into position. Dressed in black, the jumpers waited in the darkness, timing their move perfectly. The train was traveling at about 25 miles per hour, fast enough to pose a challenge but slow enough to board. One by one, the jumpers ran alongside the train and leaped onto its narrow ledges, gripping the handrails for stability. With practiced ease, they navigated the moving train, their footsteps barely audible over the sound of the wheels clattering against the tracks. Reaching the target railcar, the jumpers used crowbars to pry open its heavy doors. Inside, they found boxes filled with Tommy Hilfiger clothing. Exactly what they had been expecting. Working quickly but carefully, they began handing the boxes down to the loaders waiting below. Each box was worth thousands of dollars, and the crew knew they had only minutes to complete the job. The stolen goods were loaded into a waiting van, stolen earlier that evening from a nearby rail yard, to blend in with other vehicles in the area. The operation was a race against time. Spotters monitored police scanners, ready to alert the crew at the first sign of trouble. Monken coordinated the entire operation using encrypted communications, ensuring that every member of the team knew their role and the timing of the escape. In just under 10 minutes, the crew had unloaded 50 cases of designer clothing and vanished into the night. When the train reached its destination, rail yard workers were met with an empty car and no sign of the thieves. The scale and precision of the heist left authorities stunned. It was clear that the Conrail Boyz were no ordinary criminals. They had executed one of the most daring train robberies in modern history, leaving behind no clues other than the absence of the stolen goods. For Monken and his crew, the Tommy Hilfiger heist was another success, but it also marked the height of their audacity. While the heist showcased their skill and organization, it also drew increased attention from law enforcement. Investigators were now more determined than ever to bring the Conrail Boyz to justice, setting the stage for the crew's eventual downfall. For years, the Conrail Boyz seemed untouchable. Their methods were so sophisticated, and their operations so well coordinated, that even when law enforcement knew they were behind a string of daring heists, they couldn't prove it. But as the gang's confidence grew, so did their risks. A single misstep, whether jumping onto a train too late or underestimating police presence, could result in injury, arrest, or worse. The physical risks were significant. Jumpers ran alongside speeding trains, matching their pace before leaping onto narrow ledges with little more than a handrail for support. The work demanded physical strength, balance, and complete focus. Even the loaders and drivers weren't immune to danger. The crew often operated in remote areas surrounded by swamps or industrial zones, where rough terrain and the threat of surprise encounters with law enforcement added to the challenges. Yet the rewards made it all worthwhile. Unlike petty thieves who took whatever they could get, the Conrail Boyz were selective. They focused on high-value shipments, so a single successful heist could bring in hundreds of thousands of dollars. The Tommy Hilfiger job, for example, netted them an estimated $200,000 in one night. For the gang, these scores weren't just lucrative, they were routine. Edward Monken's leadership ensured that profits were maximized and efficiently distributed. The fences he worked with provided quick cash for stolen goods, often reselling them in secondary markets across the region. Monken kept tight control over these transactions, ensuring that the full scope of the operation remained hidden from all but a select few. This secrecy allowed the Conrail Boyz to continue operating for years, even as law enforcement intensified their efforts to shut them down. The financial rewards extended beyond cash. Monken's crew enjoyed a lifestyle that reflected their successes. Gang members drove expensive cars, wore the latest fashion, and frequented upscale restaurants and clubs. Monken himself was known to gamble away large sums in Atlantic City, casually pulling out wads of cash worth tens of thousands of dollars. For a time, The Conrail Boyz lived like kings, their wealth fueled by the very system they had exploited. But the risks weren't limited to physical danger. The gang's growing profile made them a priority target for law enforcement. Each heist left behind a trail of questions and frustration, pushing investigators to step up their efforts. The more the crew stole, the closer they came to attracting the wrong kind of attention. So, technically, the Conrail Boyz thrived in a high-stakes world where risk and reward were inseparable. Their daring methods and incredible profits made them one of the most successful criminal groups of their time. By the early 2000s, the Conrail Boyz had become a high-priority target for multiple law enforcement agencies. The sheer scale of their thefts demanded a coordinated response. Investigators from local, state, and federal agencies began pooling resources, determined to dismantle the gang. However, one of the biggest challenges for these investigators was the scale of the rail network. The tracks stretched for hundreds of miles across New Jersey, passing through industrial zones, quiet suburbs, and remote areas with little to no surveillance. With so much ground to cover, law enforcement simply couldn't monitor every mile of track. This gave the Conrail Boyz the advantage of striking in isolated locations where the chances of being spotted were slim. The gang's use of technology also posed a major hurdle. Mongan's stolen two-way radios allowed the crew to monitor police communications in real time. They knew when patrols were nearby and could adjust their plans accordingly. The introduction of encrypted Nextel phones further complicated matters, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to intercept their calls. These tools gave the gang an edge, allowing them to stay coordinated and informed while keeping investigators in the dark. Even when law enforcement managed to catch the gang in action, the terrain often worked against them. The Conrail Boyz chose locations surrounded by swamps, industrial ruins, or dense vegetation. Basically, places where escape routes were plentiful. If a heist was interrupted, the gang members could vanish into the night, leaving little to no evidence behind. This made pursuing them not only difficult but often futile. Another challenge was the gang's organizational structure. Mongan's leadership style was built on secrecy and compartmentalization. Only he knew the full scope of their operations, including the identities of the fences who purchased their stolen goods. This made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to infiltrate the group or trace the stolen merchandise back to its buyers. Even when individual members of the crew were arrested, they rarely had enough information to significantly advance the investigation. The nature of the crimes themselves added to the difficulty. Train thefts were often treated as property crimes rather than violent offenses, which meant that even when crew members were caught, they faced relatively lenient sentences. This lack of deterrence allowed the gang to regroup and continue their operations with minimal disruption. It wasn't until investigators began pursuing racketeering charges, a strategy typically reserved for dismantling organized crime, that they were able to build a case strong enough to take down the entire group. The turning point came when undercover agents infiltrated the group's network of buyers. These fences, who had been purchasing and reselling the stolen goods, provided investigators with the first concrete leads tying the Conrail Boyz to their crimes. Surveillance became a key tool in the investigation. Law enforcement tracked Mongan and his crew around the clock, documenting their movements and building a case piece by piece. Investigators recorded Mongan's frequent trips to Atlantic City, where he spent thousands of dollars gambling and flaunting his wealth. These observations painted a picture of a man who had profited enormously from his crimes, but had grown careless in covering his tracks. The gang's encrypted communications, once a significant advantage, became a liability as investigators developed ways to intercept and analyze their calls. Combined with informants from within the crew and detailed accounts from fences, law enforcement began to piece together the structure of the operation. Wiretaps and recorded conversations revealed the inner workings of the Conrail Boyz, from how they planned their heists to how Mongan controlled the flow of money and goods. The final blow came in December 2001 during a sting operation that targeted Mongan and his second-in-command, Michael Santano. Law enforcement staged a raid at a nightclub in Jersey City, where Mongan was known to spend time. With over 20 officers involved, the operation was carefully coordinated to ensure there was no chance of escape. As Mongan left the club, he was surrounded and taken into custody. Santano was arrested shortly after. The evidence against the Conrail Boyz was overwhelming. Investigators presented a mountain of material, including surveillance footage, intercepted communications, and testimony from informants. Mongan and his crew faced dozens of federal charges, ranging from racketeering to theft and conspiracy. In total, 23 members of the gang were indicted alongside Mongan, marking the end of one of the most sophisticated train robbery operations in American history. In court, the prosecution laid out the full extent of the Conrail Boyz' crimes. They detailed how the gang had stolen millions of dollars in cargo, outsmarted law enforcement for years, and operated with military-like precision. Mongan, faced with overwhelming evidence, eventually pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 13 years in prison, while other members of the crew received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. The downfall of the Conrail Boyz marked a victory for law enforcement, but it also highlighted the vulnerabilities within the rail system that the gang had exploited. The gang's story also serves as a cautionary tale. Their ability to adapt and innovate was matched only by their overconfidence, which ultimately became their downfall. The same meticulous planning that made them legends in train robbery left behind a trail of evidence that investigators used to bring them to justice. The investigation into their activities also demonstrated the power of persistence and collaboration, as multiple agencies came together to dismantle a criminal enterprise that had seemed unstoppable. Today, the Conrail Boyz is remembered as one of the most daring train robbery crews in American history. For those who lived through their reign, their story is a reminder of the fine line between brilliance and recklessness, and the ultimate price of believing you can't be caught. For Mongan, the man who once controlled one of the most daring criminal enterprises in modern history, the view of the railways was now confined to the window of his New Jersey prison cell. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more interesting videos.